Welcome again. In this video, I'm going to move from the MVC architecture pattern to the layer pattern and add some layer that will help to the maintainability of the application. But first, I want to do a fast recap of what did in the previous videos. First, we create the infrastructure, and in this section of the videos I created the VPC, the subnets, the gateways, the internet gateway for the infrastructure. I have a video for that creation. Then I created the infrastructure for the EC2 instance when we are going to run one container for the dev container, where we are going to develop the backend and frontend, and create the second EC2 instance. And in that instance, I'm going to run a container with MySQL. And then I created this application, this demo application. I'm going to close it and show you what we created. We created a Maven with a SpringBoot application, and I create the necessary classes to have or running the application and implement and select and create the guest. And I show you in the previous video how you can test the API running the kulala or using the kulala plugin to run or test the API. Now in this video I'm going to show you how to pass from the MVC architecture to layer architecture, how to implement best practices in the application, how to create or use or implement their DTO pattern, how to create a services layer, how to add the error handling using aspect-oriented programming, how to create unit testing. With that, let's start. First, I'm going to show you what we created in past video. We created the model and the controller. In this model, I created the guest entity, marked this class like an entity, and using lombok to add the getter and setter with the data annotation. And then I created the reservation entity, and in this entity is pretty similar to the guest, but here I have the along like an ID. I create the date in, date out, and cost. With this entity reservation, we create an annotation of one-to-many, and this relationship is one-to-many, one guest to many reservation, and I created this attribute reservations for this entity guest. Then I created the guest controller, and in this guest controller we defined the class like a REST controller and request mapping. And here we created or called the repository to save the entities, and here we defined a method to get all. This method get all the guests from our database, and here we created the create method to create a new guest. I'm going to start explaining what is the best way or recommended way to naming our REST controller. The recommended way is to define what is this REST controller. In this case, it's an API, and the first one is API. The second one is the version of this API. In this case, is version 1, and what entity or what is the objective of this REST controller in this case is to work with guest, but the recommended is to naming with in plural, and for that reason I'm going to add this s to the end of the guests. And if you think or you are curious about how the editing or deleting naming should be, the recommendation is after the definition of this guest, we need to add the name of the action, for example in this case editing, for example edit, and the code of the entity, for example the entity 3, we want to edit this entity, and that is the convention and best practice to name these kind of APIs. Let's delete this, and let's change the DTOs, or add the DTOs to our application to carry information from the controller to our entities in the model. To do that, first I'm going to create a new folder, DTOs folder. Here we are going to store our DTO and create our first DTO, naming a reservation DTO.java. In this class I'm going to, or this record, I'm going to define a new record. This is a new way to create objects in Java. I'm going to define the records or the attributes for our reservation. Let's copy and paste the different attributes that we are going to use in our entity. And let's delete the private and replace the 2 comma. Let's delete and delete, and here replace by comma, replace that comma, and delete the last one. Let's save, and we have our first DTO, the reservation DTO. And now let's create the second one, the guest DTO.java. And here I'm going to define the new record, and here I'm going to copy the attributes for the guest. Let's copy these attributes, copy and paste. Okay, let's do replace for comma, delete this one, delete this one, replace for comma, and delete this definition, and delete this one. Okay, let's close this entity. Here we have to import the interface from java.util, and here the reservation is not an entity. We have here the new reservation DTO that we created. Cool, we have two DTOs for our application. The guest DTO and reservation DTO. Now I'm going to add a layer, the service layer, and in this layer we are going to communicate the controller with the model, and the services layer control the transaction between these two layers. Okay, let's create the services folder, and here I'm going to define the guest service interface, and in this interface I'm going to define the method that will be exposed to our controller. The first one could be the creation, and the creation will return a new guest DTO, the guest created. Let's to name it like create, and here receive a guest DTO, but this guest get DTO is the information or have the information of the guest but not the saved guest. Okay, let's to define the update. The difference between the creation and update is the ID. In this case, we have an integer ID for the guest. If we are going to update the guest, is because it is saved and have assigned an ID. And the other one is the deletion. The deletion. Delete. We need the ID to delete and call the ID to delete. Okay, we define the creation, create, update, and delete. Delete. Now, to create the search all the guests, it is recommended, or the correct way is to define the pagination for this guest, because if we work like we work in the controller currently, for example here we return all our guests in our database. But what happens if we have hundreds or thousands of guests in our database? We will return all of that guests. For that reason, we will need a pagination for this entity. Okay, let's to create the pagination. To do that, let's first to define an object or the DTO objects with the response of this pageable object. Let's to create the guest DTO response object, and in this object I'm going to define the content. It's a list of guest DTO, excuses, with the content. And in this content, forget this one. In this content, we are going to send the list of our guests, and this class should be, I'm going to add the data annotation from Lombok to add the getters and setters. And in this object, we are going to return the pageable object interface from the domain framework, this one. Okay, pageable, and this object returned a sort object from the domain, and this sort contains the information of sorting. Here return a long value with the total elements, and return a boolean indicating if it is empty or not. Return a boolean if it's the first, and a boolean indicating if it's the last, and return an integer with the size of this pagination. Return a number of elements. Return a number of elements. Okay, and I think we are done. Okay, okay, let's save. Now we have the response for our method getAll, returning the guest DTO response with the content and the corresponding pagination. Let's to add to our interface this method guest DTO response and get all, and here I'm going to receive the information for the pagination, and for this let's to receive an object pageable or interface pageable, and let's to save. Now we have defined the methods for our CRUD. I think that we will need the method to search for one guest DTO, get guest by ID. Let's create this method, and here I'm going to receive an integer ID. Okay, perfect. Now let's to implement this interface. Create a guest service implementation.java. IMP is an standard. You can find the implementation class naming with this or without this. Okay, let's to define the class and tell that this implement the interface guest services. Okay, you can see the linter is showing that we need to implement this method. Let's to run the code action from the language servers and find the first one, define add unimplemented methods and enter, and you can see all the different methods that we define in our interface. Let's to create this one first. Let's to delete this definition, and here I need the repository to access to our information or entities, and for that I'm going to define the private guest repository interface, and here I'm going to mark this class like a service component, a stereotype, and let's save. And here I'm going to define a new guest object guest, and this object we are going to use the guest repository to find or get is deprecated, find by ID, find by ID. Okay, and send the ID. Perfect. Now let's to mapping the object from our entity to our DTO. To do that, I'm going to use a well-known library called Mapp-Struct. Let's to install the Mapp-Struct library. First, correct this type optional. Okay, this find by ID return an optional from Java util guest. It is to avoid the null objects, and for the moment return null, because we need to map the information from our entity to our DTO object. Okay, let's search in the page the Mapp-Struct. Here I have the instructions, And this is the way we need to add the Mapp-Struct. First, let's copy this definition and send to the pom.xml, and here we are going to define the definition properties and paste. Okay, let's save. Now return and copy these dependencies, and search the dependencies. Let's move it to the last one before dependencies, copy. Okay, and the last one is copy this path to the annotation processor path in the Nvim plugins section. Okay, let's search for the Nvim plugins section, this one. Okay, and add the new path here. Let's save. Okay. Let's move it to the beginning path. Oh no, okay. Okay, here we go. Save. And now let's to close this NeoVim ID and run the Nvim client compile to refresh the Nvim jars. This download the Mapp-Struct library from the Nvim repositories. Let's move it to the guest services. This is the interface. Let's move it to the implementation. Okay, now we need to map this guest to the from the guest entity to the guest DTO. Before we map, we need to define the mappers, or tell to the Mapp-Struct what are the entities that we want to map. To do that, I'm going to define or create the mapper folder, and here I'm going to define the guest mapper .java. Okay, and in this interface, I'm going to define this is a mapper from Mapp-Struct. You can see the auto-completion is working fine. It indicate that the plugin was installed correctly in our environment, and define that this is a component model from the component model from Mapp-Struct that, and here we have to define that the component model is for the Spring application. Let's save, and here we need to define the mapper. In this case, I'm going to map the from DTO, or return object mapped DTO from mapper guest DTO from a guest, and receive a guest object here, guest object. Okay, and the other is that we need to map a guest object, mapper guest, from a guest DTO. Guest DTO to mapper guest from guest DTO. Okay, we defined the mapped. Now let's to map the guest, let's create a new guest DTO, and let's to add the mapper, guest mapper. Okay, and I forgot to inject these two objects to our Spring components, and to do that, let's to define code actions, and here too I'm going to search for the constructor, generate constructors. Okay, and here I'm going to add the guest repository and the guest mapper. Okay, escape, and now you can see, okay, I don't know why it's forgot to implement the guest mapper, but no matter, I'm going to add this manually. Guest mapper, and here this that guest mapper equal to guest mapper variable. Okay, now we have injected these two objects to our services, and let's to continue with these changes. Let's uncomment this section. Let's to declare this object, and here let's to add this validation. If guest that remember this is an optional, is present, then I need to map the guest. Let's to assign to the guest variable that we defined, and here I'm going to call the mapper, guest mapper field, that map DTO from the guest entity, and send the guest entity that get. Okay, and with that we have mapped the object from the entity to the DTO, and return the guest DTO, of course. Save. Okay, now we have the first method that is called the repository and mapped from entity to our DTO, and now I'm going to modify the other ones. For example, here it's pretty similar. Let's copy and paste, and here we receive we receive a guest DTO. First we need to pass or create the guest entity. We don't need the optional. Here we need to map the entity, guest mapper that map guest from DTO, the second one, and pass the DTO that we need to map. And here in the guest we need to save this in the repository. To do that, I'm going to call the guest repository that we define, and save. The entity is guest, and this will call the repository, and the repository will persist this entity and return the new entity, adding the ID or the new ID that was stored. And here I'm going to return this change to guest mapper. Now we need to map from the entity to DTO. Guest from DTO, no, it's grown. We need to map DTO from guest, and the guest is the guest entity, and return the guest, the new DTO and object. Okay, save. Same for update. Let's copy, paste, and here we receive an ID, and before we save this entity, we need to set the ID. For that, let's do set ID. Okay, and with this, the Hibernate framework know that this entity exists and we need to update the entity. Okay, and for delete, we need to call the guest repository that delete by ID and pass the ID, and done. Now we need to create this guest DTO response to search all the guests in the pageable way. To do this, it's pretty similar to this procedure, but we need to define, let's to search from the guest repository that get final. This final and pass a page, and it will return a page of guest. Return null at the moment because we need to create the mapper for map this page of guest and return an object of this guest DTO response. Let's copy and let's move it to the search for the mapper here. Okay, and here in the mapper I'm going to define the method that return the guest DTO response, and this mapper guest DTO response from a list of page of guest. Okay, and this receive the page interface from domain of guest, this guest entity page. Okay, and okay, this method should return the required object, and remember this object contain the content of the list of guests, the specification of pageable, the sort, this long total elements, the boolean if it's empty, the boolean if first, the boolean indicating if it is last, int size, int number, int number of elements, and here I will need the int, the total pages. I think we missed that. And here return to the services. And here in the services I'm going to return or map. First, let's receive the list of guests. Oh, excuse me, this is a page of guest. Page here of guest entities. Page equal. Okay, now I'm going to call the mapper that we just created. A guest DTO response. Okay, DTO response, and call the map guest mapper that mapper gets DTO response from page guest and send the page. And here we are going to return the new object that we create. Let's say, okay, we created the services, and in these services we use the repositories and map the objects in our entities to our DTO objects. Now move and edit our controllers. Go to controllers, and here we should not call directly the guest repository. The recommended way or to follow the layer architecture pattern, we need to call the services, and let's to define the services private guest service interface for guest services. And here I'm going to add the constructor. In this constructor I'm going to inject the guest services. This injection is performed from SpringBoot. This is a good advantage that we have with the object injection in or dependencies injection in Spring. Let's change this method, because we don't return get all the or the list of all guests. We are going to return the guest DTO response object, and here to return I'm going to use the guest services that let me check what is the name. Change the name is getAll. Perfect. GetAll and receive a pageable. To define the pageable, I'm going to define the default request pageable or default pageable default. Let me remember pageable default, and here I'm going to define the page, the first one by default, and the size 20 by default. And here I'm going to declare the pageable object, pageable interface, and define the variable and correct the syntax error. Okay, now we have this method with the good practices. Now let's move and create or modify the create method. Here we are going to return the DTO object and receive the DTO object guest DTO. Perfect. And say here I'm going to return the guest service that create and send the DTO object. Guest DTO let's change and delete the extra D. Guest DTO. Okay, let's change to this variable. Save. Okay, now we have the getAll method, the create method. Now go to define the update method. Let's copy, and here I'm going to define this annotation to be an path mapping, path path mapping. Okay, and here I'm going to change the name of the method to update, and we need to receive the ID in the params variable or path variables. Okay, path variables, the integer ID. Okay, and here I'm going to call the update method and send the ID and the DTO. Okay, the annotation need to have define the path. Like I said previously, we need to define the path to edit this guest. To do that, I'm going to add the edit section and define the name of the variable that we are going to use for this identifier. In this case should be ID, and here I have an error here because it is path put mapping. Put mapping. Perfect. And here in the path variable we need to tell what is the name of the variable. Okay, save, and now we have the updated method. Now I'm going to copy to create, no, I'm going to create from the beginning this delete method, delete mapping here, and the delete mapping should be slash delete slash and the ID. And here I'm going to define the public void delete, and here we need the path variable naming ID, and it is an integer ID, and return the guest service to delete and send the ID. Not return. Okay, see, perfect. I have this error. Okay, let's save. Now I think that I need to define the get by ID method around get mapping to define the method to guest slash the ID. It should be ID, but this is a path variable ID, and here I need to define the public. It returned guest DTO, get by ID, or get guest by ID. Okay, perfect. And here we need to define the path variable, and the name of the variable is ID integer ID, and here return the guest service that get by ID, get guest by ID, and send the ID. Web mapping, it's a get mapping, and okay, perfect. We defined the method required for our API. I want to tell that this method, creation method, or all the method by default return 200 in the OK response, but for this create method I'm going to add the request or response status. I think it's response status. Okay, perfect. To HTTP status reason code to HTTP status to created. Here there are the status gone, found, locked, created. We need the created status to be returned from this method. Okay, now I'm going to test this API. Let's close and run this API. Maven spring dashboot :run. Okay, and here in the test I'm going to open the other windows. I need to edit this API because we changed the path of this URL. We change it to API/v1/guests in plural, and here the same for guests. I think I need the comma here. Okay, let's check if it's running, because I can see that the server is running in port 3000. Perfect. Let's run some tests using kulala, and here you can see now we have a response. We don't have guest yet, but it returned the content. The list is null, but the object of pageable is contain the number of page, the number of size, if it is sorted or not, the sort object, the total element 0, if it's empty, and the first and last variable. Cool. Now let's to create this the first guest. I have here a post request, and here I'm going to run this request. Okay, it's successful, and you can see this API returned the code 201, and the other one, the get, return the 200 code. And here in the content, this list is not empty because we created the one guest. Okay, let's to create the update method. Let's copy this post. It is similar, and here I'm going to change to put. Okay, and in the put I'm going to edit the ID 1. Okay, and here is the same application JSON, manual guest. I'm going to update to manual guest updated, and we can change the cost from 700 to 800. Let's run, and here the response is 200, and the new data is returned. Let's select all the guests here, 200, and now the new data is returned. Now let's to create the second one, 2. Okay, and here we have two guests, and let's to create the last one method. It is for the delete method. I'm going to copy this and paste, and here the method I need to change to delete, and the URL is delete, and I want to delete the first one. Let's run, and it's okay, and let's check the list, and the list of the guests, we have the second ID. We delete the first one. Okay, with that we finished our API, but we don't finish it because we need to add some validation. For example, what happens if our application need that the name is required. If we delete this name and run, you can see the guest is created but without name. I'm going to add this validation in our application. To do that, let's open here in a new pane. Let's open the NeoVim, and let's find the DTO object for the guest DTO.java, and here I'm going to use the validation from the Jakarta validation. Here I want to define that this is not blank field. Okay, this is not a blank field. You can see in the top of the screen in the first pane that this SpringBoot running Maven with SpringBoot have integrated hot reload, and the changes reload when the application detect a change in our classes. Let's rerun this this request to send without a name. Let's run, and it is created again, but with the same the validation is not performance. And the reason for that is because here I forgot to define in the controller and tell to this method, the creation method, that we need to validate the fields inside the guest DTO. Let's to add the annotation for valid from Jakarta that validation. Let's add, save, wait to finish to reload, okay, and run again. Let's run. Okay, now the application returned an error 400 because there are an error in the request. If we go to the button of the request, we can say that not blank validation is fired for the guest DTO.name, and here is more detailed that the name must not be blank. Okay, perfect. This is the way how we can add some validation in the DTO. I'm going to add this validation for the update because when we update the guest, we need to update with the correct data. And I'm going to define for the reservation here the this date in should be not blank, the same for date out, and the same for cost. Perfect. Okay, now we finished to integrate the DTO pattern, the change from MVC to N-layer architecture. Let's to commit these changes to our repository. Git status here, correct. I'm going to add git add asterisk, and let's do a git status again. Now let's to commit using okay. First I'm going to see the git log. Okay, perfect. I need this git log because I didn't enter the configuration for my git repository. If you see, I'm going to show you git config -- global ls a list. I forget that list -- list. Okay, I don't have defined the name and I don't have defined the email. To do that, we need to configure. I don't remember, and for that reason I have a trick. I'm going to search in the aliases, grep the git. Here is the way we can define this git config for the username, but here the username that I want to configure is this one, 𝙁𝙧𝙤𝙬. Copy and done, and configure the email for this email. Here, let's copy and done. Now let's commit the changes, but first I'm going to copy the message. Git commit minus message YouTube hotel app backend change from MVC to layer architecture pattern, and create validations. Okay, commit. Now you the permissions. Let's to add the keys. Here I need the keys. I need to start the SSH agent minus start, and in SSH add I need to add the personal key, the private key, manual Yahoo add. Now with that I'm going to perform the git push. Okay, done. Now we push the changes. It is in the repository.